I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into my driveway and saw tire tracks cutting across my lawn. Deep, heavy treads that had carved through the grass like wounds, leading straight to where my guest house used to stand. Where it used to stand. Because now there was nothing but a pile of splintered wood, crushed drywall, and the skeletal remains of what had been a perfectly good structure just 3 days ago. My name is Derek Quinton, and I had just driven 14 hours straight from my uncle's funeral in Portland, Maine, back to my home in Scottsdale, Arizona. I was exhausted, grieving, and completely unprepared for what I was looking at. The guest house where my younger brother had been living while he finished his engineering degree was gone. Just gone. Demolished, like it had never existed. I sat in my truck for a full minute, hands still gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what I was seeing. The main house looked untouched. My xeriscaped front yard, with its carefully arranged desert plants and decorative rocks, appeared normal. But the back corner of my property, where the 800-square-foot guest house had stood for the past 6 years, looked like a construction site after a demolition crew had finished their work. My phone was dead. It had died somewhere around Flagstaff, and I had been too focused on getting home to stop and charge it. I grabbed the charger from my glove compartment and plugged it into my truck's USB port, waiting the agonizing few minutes it would take to power on. When it finally lit up, I had 47 missed calls and 63 text messages. The first text was from my brother, sent 2 days ago. "Dude, where are you? There are people with a bulldozer in the backyard." The second, "Derek, they're saying they have permission to demolish the guest house. I showed them the lease, but they won't listen." The third, "I called the cops. They said it's a civil matter. What do I do?" The messages continued, each one more frantic than the last, until the final one from yesterday morning. "I had to leave for my exam. I took all my stuff to Sarah's place. I'm so sorry, man. I tried to stop them. I felt my jaw clench so hard, my teeth hurt. My brother Marcus was 23 years old, a straight A student who had never caused any trouble in his life. The thought of him standing there helplessly while someone destroyed his home made my blood boil. I got out of the truck and walked toward the debris pile, my boots crunching on broken glass and shattered tile. The guest house had been nice, really nice. I had built it myself 6 years ago after getting all the proper permits from the city. It had a full bathroom, a kitchenette, a bedroom area, and even a small covered patio. It had increased my property value by at least $60,000, according to the last appraisal. As I got closer, I saw a piece of paper staked into the ground with a metal rod. I pulled it free and read it, my disbelief growing with every word. Notice of compliance action. Property located at 2847 Desert Vista Drive has been found in violation of Saguaro Heights, HOA Covenant Section 7.3.2 regarding unauthorized structures. As per the emergency powers granted to the HOA Board under Section 12.5, the structure in question has been removed at the property owner's expense. Please remit payment of $18,500 for demolition costs within 30 days to avoid legal action and property lien. Contact Susan Carmichael, HOA President, with any questions. I read it twice, then 3 times. Unauthorized structures? I had built the guest house in 2019, a full year before this neighborhood even had an HOA. The HOA had been formed in 2020 by a group of busybody residents who wanted to control what color people could paint their mailboxes and how tall their hedges could grow. I had specifically checked the covenants when they were first proposed, and there had been nothing about existing structures. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number listed on the notice. It rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, dripping with false sweetness. "Saguaro Heights, HOA, Susan speaking. This is Derek Quinton at 2847 Desert Vista Drive. You demolished my guest house." There was a pause, then a little laugh. "Mr. Quinton, yes. We've been trying to reach you for weeks about your violation. The structure was removed in accordance with our covenants. That structure was built legally with city permits before your HOA even existed. I'm afraid that's irrelevant, Mr. Quinton. All properties within the Saguaro Heights boundaries are subject to current HOA regulations, regardless of when structures were built. The covenants clearly state that no accessory dwelling units are permitted without express written approval from the board, which you never sought. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice level. You can't just demolish someone's property while they're out of town. That's illegal destruction of property. That's criminal. Actually, Mr. Quinton, if you review Section 12.5 of the covenants, you'll see that in cases of violations that pose a safety or aesthetic concern, the board has emergency powers to take corrective action. We sent you 3 certified letters and multiple emails. We even attempted to serve you in person on 5 separate occasions. You chose to ignore all our communications, so we proceeded as the covenants allow. I've been at my uncle's funeral in Maine for the past week. My phone was off. I didn't ignore anything. Well, that's certainly unfortunate timing, but it doesn't change the fact that the violation existed and has now been corrected. You'll receive an invoice for the demolition costs. Have a nice day, Mr. Quinton. She hung up. Actually hung up on me. I stood there in my destroyed backyard, covered in dust from the road, and probably about to have a rage-induced stroke, when I remembered something that made me smile for the first time in days. The cameras. I had installed a comprehensive security system 2 years ago after a string of car break-ins in the neighborhood. 8 cameras covering every angle of my property, all recording to a cloud server in glorious 4K resolution. I walked into my house, which thankfully was still standing, and went straight to my home office. My desktop computer hummed to life, and I logged into the security system's web portal. The footage was all there, organized by date and camera. I scrolled back to 3 days ago and started watching. The first camera showed a white pickup truck pulling up to my curb at 7 in the morning. A woman got out, maybe 50 years old, with short blonde hair cut in that aggressive suburban mom style that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager." She was wearing white capri pants and a turquoise blouse, oversized sunglasses perched on her head. She marched up to my front door and pounded on it like she was trying to break it down. After about 30 seconds, Marcus opened the door, looking confused. He was in sweatpants and a t-shirt, clearly just woken up. The audio on my cameras was excellent. I could hear every word. "Who are you?" the woman demanded. "I'm Marcus, Derek's brother. Who are you?" "I'm Susan Carmichael, president of the Saguaro Heights HOA. Where is Derek Quinton?" "He's out of town. Family emergency. Can I help you with something?" "This property is in violation of HOA covenants. That illegal structure in the back needs to be removed immediately. I'm here to serve final notice." Marcus rubbed his eyes. "The guest house? That's not illegal. Derek built it with city permits. I've got the paperwork inside if you want to see it." "City permits are irrelevant. HOA covenants supersede city regulations. The structure is unpermitted by the HOA and must be removed." "Okay, well, Derek will be back next week. You can talk to him about it then." "Next week is too late. This is a final notice. If the structure is not removed by noon tomorrow, the HOA will exercise its right to take corrective action." "You can't just demolish someone's house." "It's not a house. It's an unauthorized accessory structure. Read your covenants, young man." Susan turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing in the doorway looking bewildered. I fast-forwarded through the footage. The next morning at 8 o'clock, a flatbed truck arrived carrying a small bulldozer. 2 men in work clothes began unloading it. At 8:15, Susan's white pickup returned, and she got out holding a clipboard and wearing a bright pink hard hat that looked like it had never seen an actual construction site. Marcus came running out of the guest house at 8:20, fully dressed now, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "What are you doing? You can't do this!" Susan consulted her clipboard without even looking at him. "As I explained yesterday, this is a corrective action authorized by the HOA board. I called Derek. He said to not let you touch anything. He's getting a lawyer." The time for lawyers was weeks ago when he was served the first notice. The time for discussion is past. This is happening. One of the workers, a Hispanic guy probably in his 30s, looked uncomfortable. "Madam, maybe we should wait if the owner objects." The owner was properly noticed and chose not to respond. "Proceed." Marcus pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police." "Go ahead. This is a civil matter. They won't do anything." The footage showed Marcus on the phone, pacing back and forth as he talked to what I assumed was a 911 dispatcher. About 15 minutes later, a Scottsdale PD cruiser pulled up. A young officer got out and talked to Marcus, then to Susan, then walked around the guest house. After about 10 minutes of discussion that I couldn't quite hear, the officer said something to Marcus, got back in his car, and left. Marcus looked defeated. He went into the guest house and emerged multiple times over the next hour, carrying boxes and bags to his car. His laptop, his clothes, his textbooks, everything he owned loaded into his beat-up Honda Civic in a frantic rush. At 10 o'clock, Marcus drove away, and the bulldozer started up. I watched, my jaw clenched as the machine drove forward and began tearing into the guest house. The operator clearly knew what he was doing. He started with the patio cover, pulling it down in a shower of wood and metal. Then he went for the walls, the blade punching through the drywall and siding like tissue paper. The whole thing took less than 45 minutes. 45 minutes to destroy something I had spent 3 months building. Susan stood there the entire time, watching with her clipboard clutched to her chest, occasionally directing the operator to hit a particular section. When it was done, she took photos from every angle with her phone, then got in her truck and left. The demolition crew spent another hour pushing the debris into a pile, then loaded the bulldozer back onto the flatbed and drove away, leaving my property looking like a disaster zone. I saved all the footage to a separate hard drive, made 2 backup copies, and uploaded everything to a different cloud service just to be safe. Then I called my lawyer. Brian Hendricks had handled my real estate transactions when I bought this house 8 years ago. He was a sharp guy in his mid-40s who rode a motorcycle and had a reputation for being a pit bull in court. "Derek, how are you? How was your uncle's service?" "It was fine. Brian, I need your help. My HOA demolished my guest house while I was gone." There was a pause. "They what?" I explained everything. The notices I never received, the demolition, Susan Carmichael's attitude, the police officer who said it was a civil matter. Brian listened without interrupting. "Do you have any documentation showing you built the guest house with proper permits?" he asked when I finished. "Every single permit, inspection certificate, and approval letter, all filed properly with the city." "And the HOA covenants, when were they established?" "The HOA was formed in 2020. The guest house was completed in 2019. "Okay, and you have footage of the demolition?" "Every second of it, multiple angles, high definition, audio, everything." I could hear Brian smile through the phone. "Derek, I think we're going to be able to help you. What they did was illegal on multiple levels. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? Bring all your documentation and the video footage." "I'll be there at 9. "Perfect. And Derek, don't talk to anyone from the HOA. Don't respond to any letters or emails. All communication goes through me from now on." That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about Marcus, about how scared and helpless he must have felt watching strangers destroy his home. I thought about Susan Carmichael standing there with her pink hard hat, so pleased with herself for enforcing the precious covenants. I thought about the 2 workers who had just been doing a job, probably not even realizing they were participating in something illegal. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and went through the box of paperwork I kept in my filing cabinet. I found everything. The original building permit application from March 2019, the approval letter from the Scottsdale Planning Department, the inspection reports from the electrical, plumbing, and structural inspections, all signed off. The final certificate of occupancy dated June 2019. The appraisal I had done in 2021 that listed the guest house as a legitimate permitted structure. I also found the HOA covenant package I had received in the mail back in 2020 when the HOA was first formed. I had read through it carefully at the time, worried about exactly this kind of thing. There had been restrictions on new construction, on exterior paint colors, on landscaping choices. But there had been a grandfather clause, Section 3.2, which clearly stated that structures existing prior to the formation of the HOA were exempt from architectural approval requirements as long as they had been built with proper permits and did not pose a safety hazard. I took photos of everything with my phone and emailed them to Brian. The next morning, I drove to Brian's office in downtown Scottsdale. His secretary, a cheerful woman named Patricia, offered me coffee and led me to a conference room where Brian was already set up with his laptop and a legal pad covered in notes. "Derek, come in. I've been doing some research since we talked yesterday. This is even worse than I thought from their perspective." Worse how? Brian pulled up a document on his laptop. Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 33-1803. HOAs are specifically prohibited from taking self-help remedies that involve destruction of property without a court order. Even with the broadest possible interpretation of their covenants, they needed to go to court first, get a judgment against you, and then get a court order for demolition. What they did was criminal destruction of property under Arizona law. That's what I told Susan. She said the covenants gave them emergency powers. Emergency powers in HOA covenants typically apply to things like cutting overgrown grass or removing a dangerous tree. They absolutely do not extend to demolishing an 800-square-foot dwelling. Did you bring the footage? I pulled out my laptop and showed him everything. We watched the whole sequence together. Brian stopped the video several times to take notes, particularly during Susan's conversations with Marcus. "This is gold," Brian said. She admits on camera that she knows Derek built it with city permits. She acknowledges that Marcus objected. She ordered the demolition to proceed anyway. This is malicious, intentional destruction of property. Do you know what your guest house was worth? The last appraisal valued it at $60,000 as an addition to the property value. But to rebuild it from scratch, with current labor and material costs, probably closer to $90,000. Brian wrote down the numbers. Okay, here's what we're going to do. First, we file a police report. This is criminal and I want it on record. Second, we file an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order preventing the HOA from taking any further action against your property. Third, we file a civil lawsuit against the HOA, Susan Carmichael personally, and the demolition company for destruction of property, trespass, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of Arizona's HOA statutes. We're going to ask for actual damages to cover rebuilding the guest house, punitive damages because this was malicious, and attorney's fees. How much are we talking about in total? With punitive damages, could be $500,000 or more if we get a sympathetic jury. Arizona courts don't like HOAs that abuse their power, and this is one of the most egregious cases I've seen. We spent the next 2 hours going through everything in detail. Brian had me write out a timeline of events, make a list of all the ways the demolition had affected me and my brother, and sign several documents authorizing him to represent me. At noon, we drove together to the Scottsdale Police Department. We met with a detective named Rodriguez, who watched the footage with an expression that grew increasingly disturbed. "This is pretty clear-cut," Detective Rodriguez said. "Criminal damage in the first degree, which is a felony because the value exceeds $10,000, possibly trespassing. I'll need to investigate, talk to the HOA president and the demolition company, but based on what I'm seeing here, I think we'll be presenting charges to the county attorney's office." "How long does that process take?" I asked. "Could be a few weeks, could be a few months. Depends on how cooperative everyone is and how busy the prosecutor's office is. But you've got excellent evidence here. That helps a lot." We filed a formal police report, and Detective Rodriguez gave me a case number. Brian and I left the station with the understanding that the detective would be in touch as the investigation progressed. Over the next week, things moved quickly. Brian filed the emergency restraining order, and we got a court hearing scheduled for the following Monday. He also filed the civil lawsuit, which meant Susan Carmichael and the HOA board had to be formally served with papers. I was home on Thursday afternoon when I saw Susan's white pickup truck pull up in front of my house. She got out, marched up to my door, and started pounding on it just like she had done to Marcus. I watched her through my front window for a minute, debating whether to even answer. Finally, I opened the door. "Derek Quinton?" she demanded. "You know who I am, Susan. You need to drop this ridiculous lawsuit immediately. The HOA acted within its rights, and you're wasting everyone's time and money. You demolished an $80,000 structure without a court order. That's illegal. The covenants clearly state that unauthorized structures can be removed by the HOA. The covenants also clearly state that structures built before the HOA was formed are grandfathered in. You know that. You just didn't care." Susan's face was turning red. "That structure was an eyesore and a violation. Multiple neighbors complained about it." "Really? Which neighbors? I'd love to hear their names." "That's confidential." "Of course it is. Look, Susan, you screwed up. You broke the law. You destroyed my property without legal authority. Now you're going to pay for it. The HOA has insurance. We'll fight this, and we'll win. You're the one who's going to end up paying legal fees. We'll see. Now get off my property. She opened her mouth to say something else, but I closed the door in her face. I watched through the window as she stood there for a moment, furious, before stomping back to her truck. The court hearing on Monday was exactly what I hoped it would be. Brian presented the video footage to the judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Reeves, who had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense. The HOA's lawyer, a nervous young guy who looked fresh out of law school, tried to argue that the covenants gave the HOA broad powers to address violations. Judge Reeves cut him off mid-sentence. "Counselor, did your client obtain a court order before demolishing the structure?" "No, Your Honor, but the covenants—" "I'm not interested in the covenants right now. I'm interested in Arizona law, which requires HOAs to seek judicial remedies before taking destructive action against property. Your client demolished an entire dwelling without court approval. That's a serious problem." "Your Honor, the HOA believed it was acting within its authority." "What the HOA believed is irrelevant. This court is issuing a temporary restraining order preventing the Saguaro Heights HOA from taking any further action against the property located at 2847 Desert Vista Drive without prior court approval. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to place the invoice demolition costs in escrow pending resolution of the underlying lawsuit. This hearing is adjourned." Brian and I walked out of the courthouse with the restraining order in hand. The HOA's lawyer tried to talk to Brian in the hallway, probably wanting to discuss a settlement, but Brian brushed him off. "Too early," Brian told me as we walked to his car. "Let them sweat for a while. Let the criminal investigation develop. The longer this goes on, the more expensive it gets for them, and the more motivated they'll be to settle for a big number." He was right. Over the next month, Detective Rodriguez interviewed Susan Carmichael, the members of the HOA board, and the owners of the demolition company. The demolition company immediately threw Susan under the bus, producing a contract that showed she had hired them personally and told them she had legal authority to order the work. The contract even included a clause indemnifying the demolition company against any legal liability, which their lawyer had apparently insisted on because the job seemed questionable. The HOA board members, when interviewed separately, all told the same story. Susan had told them about my illegal guest house at a board meeting. She had said she would handle it and get the structure removed. None of them had seen the actual covenants or consulted with a lawyer. They had just trusted Susan's judgment because she was the president and seemed to know what she was doing. In late June, nearly 2 months after the demolition, Detective Rodriguez called to tell me that the Maricopa County Attorney's Office was moving forward with criminal charges against Susan Carmichael. She was being charged with 1 count of criminal damage in the first degree, a Class 4 felony carrying a potential sentence of up to 3 years in prison. "Will she actually go to jail?" I asked. "Hard to say," Rodriguez replied. "First offense, she's not a flight risk and she has ties to the community. She'll probably get probation and restitution. But she'll have a felony record and she'll be personally liable for the damages. We're also charging her with trespassing, which is a misdemeanor." The criminal charges changed everything. Suddenly, the HOA's insurance company was taking the case very seriously because Susan's actions might not be covered under the HOA's liability policy. Insurance policies typically don't cover intentional criminal acts. The HOA's lawyer reached out to Brian about settlement discussions. We met at Brian's office on a Thursday afternoon in early July. The HOA had sent 2 lawyers this time, an older woman named Margaret Chen, who clearly had significant experience, and the young guy from the hearing whose name I learned was Kyle. "Mr. Quinton," Margaret began, "my clients recognize that mistakes were made in this situation. Ms. Carmichael acted without proper authorization, and the HOA board failed to provide adequate oversight. We're prepared to make you whole." "Define make me whole," I said. "We're prepared to offer full reimbursement for the cost of rebuilding the guest house, plus $20,000 for your inconvenience and emotional distress. In exchange, you would agree to drop the lawsuit and sign a mutual release." Brian didn't even let me respond. "That's insulting. Your client demolished a legal structure without court authority. Your president is facing felony charges. My client has documented damages of at least $90,000 to rebuild, plus his brother's property that was lost, plus emotional distress, plus violation of statutory rights. We're not settling for cost plus 20. Margaret and Kyle exchanged glances. What number did you have in mind? Margaret asked. 300,000, Brian said without hesitation. 200,000 in damages and emotional distress, 100,000 in punitive damages. Plus, your client agrees to amend the HOA covenants to explicitly grandfather in all pre-existing structures, and Susan Carmichael resigns as president immediately. Kyle actually laughed. That's ridiculous. The HOA doesn't have that kind of money in reserves. Then you'll need to levy a special assessment on all the homeowners, or your insurance company can pay it, assuming they don't deny coverage based on Susan's criminal conduct. Either way, that's our number. This meeting is over. We walked out, leaving the HOA's lawyers sitting there looking stunned. Did we just blow up a settlement? I asked Brian when we got outside. Nope. We set an anchor point. They know we're serious. They know they're in trouble. They'll talk to their insurance carrier, run some numbers, and come back with a better offer. Trust me. 2 weeks later, they did. Margaret called Brian and offered $150,000 plus the covenant amendment and Susan's resignation. Brian countered at $275,000. They went back and forth for another week before settling on $225,000. I signed the settlement agreement in early August, almost 4 months after the demolition. The HOA's insurance company cut a check for the full amount, though I heard later that they were pursuing a separate lawsuit against Susan personally to recover what they paid out. The HOA also agreed to pay all of my attorney's fees, which added another $40,000 to their total cost. Susan Carmichael pleaded guilty to criminal damage in September and was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 300 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution of $95,000 directly to me for the replacement value of the guest house. The judge made it clear during sentencing that she was being lenient because Susan had no prior record, but that any violation of probation would result in jail time. Ms. Carmichael, Judge Reeves said at the sentencing hearing, you abused a position of trust in your community. You used the authority given to you by your neighbors to bully and intimidate someone, and you destroyed their property out of spite and arrogance. HOAs serve a legitimate purpose when run responsibly, but you turned yours into a tool for harassment. I hope you learned something from this experience. Susan stood there crying, her husband beside her looking mortified. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Then I remembered Marcus standing in my driveway trying to stop the bulldozer, and my sympathy evaporated. I used the settlement money to rebuild the guest house, better than it was before. I hired a professional contractor this time instead of doing it myself, and we added some nice touches like better windows, upgraded appliances, and a more efficient HVAC system. Marcus moved back in when it was finished in November, just in time for his final semester of college. The Saguaro Heights HOA elected a new president, a retired engineer named Bill, who seemed to actually understand that the HOA's job was to maintain common areas and enforce reasonable rules, not to destroy people's property. He reached out to me personally to apologize for what happened and to assure me that the board was implementing new procedures to prevent anything like it from happening again. The covenant amendments were filed and recorded in December, explicitly stating that any structure built with proper city permits before January 1st, 2020, was considered a legal conforming structure exempt from HOA architectural approval requirements. Several other homeowners in the neighborhood had similar pre-existing improvements, and they were relieved to have the protection in writing. As for Susan, I saw her at the grocery store one day in January, almost a year after the demolition. She was by herself, pushing a cart and looking tired. She saw me and immediately turned down a different aisle. I let her go. I'd gotten everything I wanted: justice, compensation, and the satisfaction of knowing that her arrogance and bullying had cost her dearly. Marcus graduated in May with honors and got a job with a tech company in Phoenix. He stayed in the guest house for a few more months while he saved up for his own place, and we spent a lot of evenings sitting on the new patio, drinking beer and talking about how crazy the whole situation had been. I still can't believe she just demolished it, Marcus said one night. Like, who does that? Who thinks that's okay? Someone who's never been told no, I replied. Someone who thinks the rules don't apply to them because they're the one making the rules. You think she learned anything from it? I shrugged. Maybe, probably not. People like Susan don't really change. They just get better at hiding their true colors. Well, at least the new HOA president seems normal. Yeah, Bill's all right. He actually called me last week to ask about hosting a neighborhood barbecue. Can you imagine Susan doing that? Marcus laughed. Susan would have made it mandatory and fined people who didn't show up. The whole experience taught me something valuable about HOAs and community governance. When done right, with reasonable people focused on actually maintaining and improving the neighborhood, they can be beneficial. But when they fall into the wrong hands, when someone like Susan Carmichael gets a taste of power and decides to wield it like a weapon, they become nightmares. I'm grateful I had the cameras. Without that footage, it would have been my word against Susan's, and who knows how it would have turned out. The video evidence made everything clear and undeniable. It showed exactly what happened, who was responsible, and how malicious the whole thing was. I'm also grateful for Brian Hendricks and his willingness to fight hard on my behalf. A lot of lawyers might have pushed me to settle early and move on. Brian understood that this was about more than money. It was about accountability, about making sure Susan faced consequences for her actions, and about protecting other homeowners from similar abuse. The criminal case was particularly important. If we had only pursued the civil lawsuit, Susan would have written a check from the HOA's insurance and moved on with her life, probably thinking she had gotten away with it. The felony conviction and the probation and the community service and the personal restitution order made it real for her. She lost her position in the community. She lost her reputation. She gained a criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. Some people might think that's too harsh, that she made a mistake and paid too high a price. I disagree. She didn't make a mistake. She made a deliberate choice to abuse her authority and destroy someone else's property because she thought she could get away with it. That's not a mistake. That's malicious conduct that deserves serious consequences. The ripple effects went beyond just Susan, too. The HOA had to levy a special assessment of $300 per household to cover the legal costs and settlement that weren't covered by insurance. That meant every homeowner in Saguaro Heights felt the impact of Susan's actions in their wallet. Several board members resigned out of embarrassment. The whole organization had to rebuild its reputation and credibility. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that some residents tried to dissolve the HOA entirely after the scandal, but they couldn't get enough votes. Instead, they settled for the leadership changes and the new procedures Bill implemented. Things like requiring board approval before taking any enforcement action, mandatory legal review of any potential violation notices, and a formal appeals process for homeowners who disagreed with HOA decisions. In February, more than a year after the original demolition, I got a letter in the mail from Susan's lawyer. It was a payment schedule showing how she planned to pay off the $95,000 in restitution over the next 10 years. She was making monthly payments of $833 directly to an account the court had set up. Every month for the next decade, she would be reminded of what she did and what it cost her. I won't lie, there was something satisfying about that. Not in a vindictive way, but in a justice has been served way. Actions have consequences. Abuse of power has consequences. Bullying has consequences. Susan learned that lesson the hard way. Marcus moved out in July into a nice apartment near his new job. We threw a party at the guest house to celebrate, inviting friends and some of the neighbors who had been supportive during the whole ordeal. Bill from the HOA board even stopped by with his wife and brought a bottle of nice whiskey. "To Derek," Bill said, raising his glass in a toast, "for standing up to tyranny, one HOA president at a time." Everyone laughed and drank, and I felt genuinely happy for the first time since my uncle's funeral that had started this whole mess. Life was good. My property was whole again. Justice had been served. My brother was launching his career. The neighborhood was in better hands. After everyone left and I was cleaning up, I walked around the new guest house, running my hand along the walls and examining the craftsmanship. It really was better than the original. Better insulation, better finishes, better layout. In a weird way, Susan had done me a favor by forcing me to rebuild with newer, better materials, and professional installation. Of course, it had cost her $225,000 plus legal fees, plus $95,000 in restitution, plus her reputation, plus her criminal record, so maybe not such a great favor after all. I kept all the video footage, backed up in multiple places. Sometimes I would watch it just to remind myself that it really happened, that someone really did think they had the authority to demolish my property while I was at a funeral. It seemed almost unbelievable in retrospect, like something that would happen in a movie, not in real life. But it did happen in real life, and the cameras caught everything, and justice was served. That's what matters. The guest house saga became somewhat famous in local HOA circles. Brian told me he'd gotten several calls from other attorneys asking about the case and the strategy we used. Apparently, it was being taught as a cautionary tale in some HOA management seminars as an example of what not to do. I also heard that home sales in Saguaro Heights dropped for a while after the news coverage of the case. People were nervous about buying into a neighborhood with such a dysfunctional HOA, even after the leadership change. Property values took a small hit, maybe 3 to 5% according to the real estate agents I talked to. That was another consequence Susan probably hadn't considered when she ordered that bulldozer onto my property. In October, I got a call from a reporter at the Arizona Republic who was doing a story about HOA abuse cases in the Phoenix metro area. She wanted to interview me about my experience. I agreed, figuring it might help other people who were dealing with similar situations. The article came out a week later, a long piece profiling 3 different homeowners who had been victimized by their HOAs. My case was the lead story, with a photo of the reconstructed guest house and quotes from Brian about the legal issues involved. The article made some good points about the need for better oversight of HOAs and stronger protections for homeowners. After the article published, I got several emails and calls from people in similar situations. One guy in Tempe had his custom pergola torn down by his HOA. A woman in Mesa had been fined $15,000 for having the wrong shade of beige on her house. A retired couple in Gilbert was being harassed by their HOA president over a solar panel installation that was explicitly protected by state law. I tried to help where I could, referring people to Brian or other lawyers I had met during my case. I shared my story and my advice. Document everything. Know your rights. Don't be afraid to fight back when the HOA oversteps its authority. By the time the second anniversary of the demolition rolled around in April, life had fully returned to normal. Marcus was thriving in his career, dating a nice woman he had met at work. The guest house was generating some income because I had started renting it out on Airbnb occasionally when Marcus wasn't using it. The HOA was functioning properly under Bill's leadership, actually doing useful things like maintaining the common areas and organizing neighborhood events. Susan Carmichael was making her monthly restitution payments on time, according to the court records I could access online. She had stayed out of trouble, as far as I knew, and was fulfilling the terms of her probation. She had even completed her community service hours, working at a homeless shelter downtown. I thought about her sometimes, wondered if she really understood why what she did was wrong, or if she just resented getting caught and punished. I hoped it was the former, but I suspected it was the latter. People like Susan rarely engage in genuine self-reflection. One Saturday afternoon in May, I was working in my yard when Bill walked over from his house across the street. He had a concerned look on his face. "Derek, got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" "We've got a potential situation at the HOA. One of the board members wants to start cracking down on violations again. Nothing like what Susan did, just normal stuff like overgrown weeds and cars parked on the street. But some of the other homeowners are nervous after what happened with you. I wanted to get your take on it." I thought about it for a moment. Enforcing reasonable rules isn't a problem, Bill. That's what HOAs are supposed to do. The issue with Susan wasn't that she wanted to enforce the rules. It was that she made up rules that didn't exist, ignored the grandfather clause, and demolished my property without legal authority. As long as you're following the actual covenants, being fair and consistent, and going through proper legal channels when necessary, you'll be fine. Bill nodded, looking relieved. That's what I told them. I just wanted to make sure you were okay with the HOA actually doing some enforcement again. I'm fine with it. Just don't demolish anyone's house while they're at a funeral, and we won't have any problems." Bill laughed. "I think that's a pretty low bar to clear." We talked for a few more minutes about neighborhood stuff, and then he headed back home. I went back to my yard work, feeling good about the state of things. The neighborhood had healed. The HOA was functioning properly. My property was intact and improved. Justice had been served. As I worked, I glanced up at the security cameras mounted on the corners of my house and the guest house. 8 cameras, recording everything, backing up to the cloud. I'd added 2 more after the incident, just to be sure I had complete coverage of my entire property. Some people might think that's paranoid. After what I went through, I think it's just prudent. You never know when you're going to need video evidence to prove what really happened. You never know when someone with a little bit of power is going to decide they can do whatever they want with your property. The cameras are always watching, always recording, always ready to tell the truth about what happened. Susan Carmichael learned that the hard way. Hopefully, no one else in Saguaro Heights will need to learn the same lesson. That evening, I invited Marcus over for dinner. We grilled steaks on the new patio behind the guest house and talked about everything and nothing. His job, his girlfriend, my work, neighborhood gossip, politics, sports, normal stuff, good stuff. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I felt grateful for how everything had turned out. Not grateful that it happened, obviously, but grateful that I had been able to fight back effectively, that justice had been served, that my property had been restored. "You ever think about what would have happened if you didn't have the cameras?" Marcus asked, reading my mind. "All the time. It would have been a nightmare. Susan would have claimed she had every right to do what she did. Her lawyer would have muddied the waters. It might have taken years to resolve, and I might not have won. Those cameras are the best investment you ever made. Damn right they are." We finished our steaks and sat there in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out. Life was good. The nightmare was over. The guest house stood solid and new behind us, a testament to justice served and rights defended. And if anyone ever tried something like that again, 8 cameras would be watching, recording every second, ready to tell the truth. The end.